Hi and welcome to Axiom Chemistry. In this video, we're going to talk about elements and atoms, but first a quick review of what we've discussed about particles. As we've seen, all materials are made of particles, and we've talked a little bit about particles in different states and about how they can move from one state to another, and how they can spontaneously mix or diffuse. And now we're going to start thinking a bit more about what those particles actually are. So I want to imagine that you've been given a block of pure gold, like one of these blocks shown in the picture here. What would happen if you were to take that block of gold and chop it in half? Well, you'd end up with two smaller pieces of gold, but they'd still be gold. And if you took one of those smaller pieces and you chopped it in half, well, you'd end up with two even smaller pieces of gold. And if you kept chopping and chopping, well, you'd end up with smaller and smaller pieces of gold. But could you keep on doing that forever? Could you, theoretically, just keep chopping and chopping and chopping and still have gold? Well, the answer is actually no. Eventually you'd get to the point where, if you were able to break it up again, it would actually no longer be gold. And at that point, just before you did that final chop, you'd have been left with just one atom of gold. So one atom of gold is the smallest particle of gold that you can have. And if you were able to split that one atom apart, well, you'd actually no longer have gold anymore. You'd have a mixture of what we call subatomic particles. Now, everything that you can see is made of atoms. So for instance, pure silver is made only out of silver atoms, and oxygen gas is made only out of oxygen atoms. As you'll see later in Axiom Chemistry, gold, silver and oxygen atoms are all different from each other, but each is the smallest amount of that substance that you can have. And each atom is very, very small. Let me try and give you some idea of just how small. So if I had one atom and I could blow it up to be the size of an apple, and that apple was blown up by the same amount, it will become the size of the whole Earth. Just pause and think about that for one moment. Here's another way of thinking about it. If you had 500,000 atoms, that's 500,000 atoms, all lined up next to each other in a neat row, they would fit across the width of a single hair. They really are very, very tiny. Now, a single type of atom, gold, silver and so on, are what we call chemical elements. Let me give you a definition of a chemical element. A chemical element is a substance that cannot be separated by ordinary chemical means into simpler substances. So there's no chemical reaction that you can do with an element to make a simpler substance. The only way you can make a simpler substance is by smashing each of the atoms of that element into pieces, which is in the realm of nuclear physics and is far outside the scope of axiom chemistry. Okay, we've seen that gold and silver and oxygen are made out of each of those elements, but many substances, like water or carbon dioxide, are made of many different elements, as we're going to see later in axiom chemistry. So, how does an atom relate to an element? Well, here's a definition for you. An atom is the smallest particle of a chemical element. So it's the smallest piece of that block of gold that you could possibly have and still have gold. Now, each chemical element has its own special symbol. So for instance, the symbol for gold is Au. Now, that might seem like a fairly strange symbol for gold. It actually comes from the Latin name for gold, aurum. So now you can see why it might be Au. Many element symbols are much easier to remember than that. So for instance, carbon is C, oxygen is O, nitrogen is N, and aluminum is Al. Just before I end this video, I want to point out that these symbols are always a capital or block letter or a capital and lowercase. So for instance, capital C for carbon and capital O for oxygen. You never just have lowercase. So for instance, the symbol for gold would never be written like this. It would always be written like this. Okay, as ever, here is a summary of what we've discussed in this video. We've seen that a chemical element is a substance that cannot be separated by ordinary chemical means into simpler substances. That each chemical element has its own chemical symbol. That an atom is the smallest particle of a chemical element, and that atoms are very tiny. If you haven't yet written any of that down, I suggest you pause the video and do that now. Well done, and see you in the next video.